In the name of the crucified Christ. Amen. Two questions for us to ponder this evening. The first is, why did Jesus have to suffer and die? I mean, if God sent Jesus as a powerful spiritual leader, a model for humanity to follow, to bring God's message to people, then how could God allow him to suffer and then to die? Doesn't that constitute a failure? Well, that question was a tough one for early Christians, a stumbling block for many. There were, I'm sure, lots of people who said, how could he possibly be the Messiah? Look what happened to him. So the answer that the early Christians found was in the book of the prophet Isaiah, and specifically in a series of poems, sometimes called the Suffering Servant poems, one of which you heard tonight in the Old Testament reading. And in these songs, there is a figure, a servant, who is a kind of a mysterious figure, never identified, but is called a prophet and a king, someone who's meant to bear justice, to bring justice, someone who is to be a light to the Gentiles, and yet also someone who will be despised and rejected, who will be abused and beaten, who will bear the sins of many, who will be punished for our transgressions, and yet by whose wounds we will be healed. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the most common interpretation is to think of the servant as actually the whole people of Israel, a nation that had been historically abused and oppressed for years and years, that had suffered greatly, and yet was intended by God to be a light for the Gentiles. But when the Christians looked at that, they said, that has to be Jesus. It's clearly Jesus. And that their understanding of that, and actually the language from Isaiah, gets infused into Paul's letters, into the Gospels, into all the early Christian writings, because for them, that's the way to understand what's happened to Jesus. So the crucifixion of Jesus goes from being a kind of catastrophic failure to something that was actually part of God's plan for salvation from the beginning. Okay, second question. All right, but how does that help us? How does that bring salvation to us? And down through the years in Christian thinking, there have been lots of ways to try to explain that. Lots of different theories in Christian theology. A lot of them, most of them, depend on the idea that there exists some kind of universal system of justice that has to be followed, and that for sin, for wrongdoing, for crimes, there has to be punishment. And the theories kind of evolve from there, that Jesus then becomes a sacrifice for our sin. And you can see this an example of how this idea gets played out, you can find in C.S. Lewis's novel, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you're not familiar with that story, it is a story about 4 children who are transported to a magical land, which is ruled over by a distant, powerful lion ruler, but in the present moment is actually under the domination of an evil witch. And in the children's adventures, one of them, Edmund, ends up being induced by the witch to betray her siblings. And that violates the divine law. And so the witch demands Edmund's life. He needs to be killed for betraying his siblings. But Aslan, who is the great lion ruler of this kingdom, comes to the witch and offers her a deal that he will substitute himself for Edmund so that the witch can kill Aslan and Edmund goes free. And the witch is delighted to accept this bargain, not realizing that, in fact, when Aslan is killed, he will come back to life. So you can see how this kind of parallels Christian thinking about the cross and about the sacrifice of Jesus. I have to admit, I have some problems with that approach. And the main problem that I see is that it assumes that there is this kind of universal law, universal system of justice, which supersedes God's will, to which even God has to be obedient. And I have trouble with that. So my own understanding of how the cross brings salvation actually begins with the incarnation. With Jesus' birth, God enters into the full experience of what it means to be a human being. In Jesus, God experiences hunger and thirst, love, and the pleasures of companionship and good work. But we know all too well that that is not the full extent of what the human experience is. And certainly in this moment of time, we're very well aware of the dark side of human nature and of the human experience, which includes fear and hatred, violence, cruelty, torture, suffering, pain, and death. And so if God is really going to experience what it means fully to be human, then doesn't God also have to experience the very worst of what it means to be human? And so God undertakes voluntarily to suffer pain, to be tortured, and to die. So here's the mystery of the cross. In Jesus, God unites the human and the divine fully. God breaks down the barrier between God and God's creation. And as God, through Jesus, fully experiences what it means to be human, so God enables us to share in the divine nature. As God submits God's self to suffering and death in human flesh, God raises human flesh to participate in divinity. So the cross becomes the cross of life. The cross is the seal and the symbol of God's promise that God will always be with us, and yes, even in us. Amen.